Scuffles break out after police shoot dead another black teenager in the US state of Missouri. We'll talk to a protester who was there about who she thinks is to blame for the violence. Islamic State terrorists capture a Jordanian pilot after the group downs a US-led coalition jet over Syria. And Russian investigators claim that they have evidence the Malaysian passenger plane, which crashed in July, killing nearly 300 people, was downed by a Ukrainian jet. Thanks for joining us this hour. My name's Neil Harvey. You're watching RT International. Now, first this hour, there is a risk of race riots returning to St. Louis in the United States. That's after police shot an 18-year-old black man. There have already been clashes in the area where it happened. Demonstrators surrounded the site of the shooting, launching firecrackers. They even tried to set fire to a gas station. 4 people were arrested. Local police said that Antonio Martin was shot after he pointed a gun at an officer. Police units responding to the resulting clashes say that no tear gas has been used. But protester Lee Maybez begs to differ, and she joins us live on the line now. Lee, very good to speak to you. Hopefully you've emerged unscathed from the scene of these incidents. Just take us through what happened to you.
Well, I got a telephone call at home saying that there was a black man that had been shot by a police officer right next to Ferguson, Missouri. So I gathered up my filming equipment, and when I got there, a small crowd had already gathered and was continuing to grow. They were just demanding answers and weren't getting any from the police.
Now, you were streaming live videos, you mentioned there, from the protest. And we do know that there were some incidents taking place there, people breaking into shops, firecrackers going off. Were you not concerned you might be injured?
I've actually been in August, which is when the incidents happened in Ferguson, in a much worse situation with most of the danger coming from the police. I also want to correct what you said in your intro. There's no risk of race riots. This isn't about race as far as between whites and blacks. This is a problem of Black lives mattering to the power structure in the system.
Okay, well, thanks for correcting us on that. Just describe the atmosphere of the protest. I mean, is there any danger, do you think, of this descending in terms of violence?
I mean, I think the potential for violence is always there until the police start correcting some of their policies. It's untold. I mean, so a black man in the United States dies every 28 hours at the hands of police. So who is it going to be in the next 28 hours? If it's in St. Louis again, we could probably have a problem.
As I mentioned, we've seen firecrackers exploding amongst the people, people even trying to set fire to buildings. Why do you think the protesters turned to aggression? Because there was a heavy police presence there. They must have known the police would have to respond in some way.
I mean, I think they're just angry. I think they're tired. This has been four young black men in the last 5 or 6 months here in St. Louis, basically one a month. And I think people are just tired. They're not really getting any real answers about how to correct these problems. And they're acting out in ways that they feel like they can communicate their anger.
I mean, you mentioned that you don't think that there's any danger of race riots, but race does play an issue, doesn't it? Because it comes hot off on the heels of other recent killings of black men at the hands of the police, and that is an element of why people are so frustrated, because they feel that this is very heavy-handed response and directed at times against certain sections of the community. Do you fear that violence is on the horizon from what you've seen on the scene there?
Today it was actually, the crowd dispersed on its own. They went home on their own. And I want to make it very clear that when the police don't force those issues and don't meet people that are mourning with aggression, the crowd just normally disperses on their own and goes home. So, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't say that we might be hanging in the balance here. I just know that people are tired.
Okay. Speaking to Lee Maybez, who was a witness at those latest anti-police protests in St. Louis. Thanks so much for coming on to speak to us.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Now, after the latest shooting, police said in a statement that the officer involved was conducting a routine check and saw two men near the gas station. As he approached, one of the men, Antonio Martin, pulled out a handgun, pointing it at the officer, who then fired several shots. And protests have also reignited in New York over the recent string of killings at the hands of police. Hundreds of demonstrators blocked major streets on Tuesday to make their voices heard over the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. Public frustration over their killings swelled after grand jury decisions not to charge the officers in either of those high-profile cases. Protests against police brutality have flared up nationwide over the last few months, and our Washington correspondent has witnessed some of them. She explains why people's anger won't calm down.
The gas station where Antonio Martin was killed is very close to Ferguson. I was there just at the end of November covering riots and protests in Ferguson over Michael Brown's killing. Michael Brown was also 18 years old, but it's too early to draw comparisons between the cases because very little is known and confirmed about the circumstances of Antonio Martin's shooting. But this is almost certain to fuel the ongoing protests, which started when at the end of November, the grand jury decided not to indict Darren Wilson for the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, and then picked up 2 weeks later when the grand jury in New York decided not to indict the police officer who put down Eric Garner. We've all seen the video of Eric Garner's killing. The man was clearly not a threat to the police. What happened to him was just tragic. It provoked such an uproar in the U.S. Everybody now knows the words, "I can't breathe." They became the chant of the protests that followed his killing. "I can't breathe," of course, being the words Eric Garner pronounced moments before he died. The fact is that those cases are different. The circumstances are different. But because history of very arguable cases, racially biased cases, it's becoming more and more difficult to focus people's attention on the specifics of any new killing. And racial bias, remember, is very difficult to prove, but many people in this country believe it's at the heart of the problem.
Now, to discuss today's protests and wider public anger aimed at police in the United States, let's go live to geopolitical analyst Eric Draitser, who's been closely following the latest events. Eric, welcome. Now, we know that the man who was killed was armed, but it still sparked major clashes. What does that tell us about the mood of the protests in America?
Well, it tells you that the protests are not about individual and isolated events or incidents, that rather the protests are a reaction against what the people perceive to be deeply rooted, deeply embedded, institutionalized racism in the United States, the kind of racism that is not simply the overt form practiced by the Ku Klux Klan or by neo-Nazis or whomever, but rather a form of racism that is deeply embedded in the very fabric of the society in this country. And I think even a cursory understanding of American history proves that point, that in fact racial bias, racial discrimination, and race hatred really lies at the foundation of what the United States is in the modern world.
What do you think the police will need to do to come back from this? Because as things stand, their reputation's taken a severe blow, and public trust has certainly been lost in large sections of the community.
Well, it's hard to say. If you're making an argument that an institution is, by its very nature, a form of an oppressive force, that's one thing. But just on the level of reform, the fact of the matter is, here in New York City, we had a quote-unquote progressive mayor elected, and as his first action, he appointed one of the most reactionary and villainous figures in recent NYPD history, Bill Bratton, to head the police police force here, someone with quite a long reputation of racially discriminatory policies, such as the so-called broken windows policing here in New York City. And so if you want to start to address the problem, even just as a first step, you could begin to ask yourself, what are we, that is to say the city of New York or the city of St. Louis or Los Angeles or wherever, what are we as a city doing to address what is undeniably a problem that is faced by a vast swath of the population of the city? We're talking about major American cities with major demographic issues, demographics that show massive portions of the city are African American, massive portions of the city that see the police as an occupying force, not as one that's there to protect them. And so you have to address a sociological phenomenon before you can start any high-minded talk about reform.
Now, an accusation that you will hear made often by black Americans is that there exists racial profiling in the country. Do you think that really does happen and that the police systematically treat black suspects differently?
It's not a matter of opinion. These are facts, and they're borne out by the evidence. You can look at the empirical arguments. There have been studies conducted in New York City as it relates to the so-called stop and frisk policy, which undeniably and inordinately targets African American and Hispanic males primarily, but people in general, and certainly does not affect the white population in the same way. And I can tell you, as somebody who's worked in predominantly minority neighborhoods in New York City, that I personally have never once been stopped and frisked by NYPD, but I know that students with whom I worked were all the time on a regular basis. And so anybody who could sit there and say that racial profiling, racial discrimination and bias doesn't enter into policing is either completely ignorant of the issue or is deliberately lying, and I would tend towards the latter.
OK, thanks for coming on to give us your analysis of the situation. We're speaking to geopolitical analyst Eric Draitser.
Thank you.
Let's move on to other news now, because the Jordanian army has confirmed that one of its pilots has been captured by Islamic State terrorists. That's after the group shot down a coalition fighter jet in Syria. Now, the aircraft was flying over the city of Raqqa, which the jihadists regard as their capital. Let's get the details from our Middle East correspondent, Paula Sleer.
ISIS does claim to have shot down a Jordanian warplane from the American-led anti-ISIS coalition over northern Syria. ISIS saying that they've captured the pilot. Now, the family has in fact confirmed this. We understand that he's a Jordanian national by the name of Muath Kasabeh. ISIS-affiliated media is flooded with pictures of the alleged pilot surrounded by 11 masked militants who seem to be celebrating his capture. Well, there have been rumors for the past 3 months at least of ISIS acquiring advanced anti-aircraft missile systems. And certainly if this is true, and the incident now does seem to suggest it, that ISIS is able to bring down planes, this is a huge blow for the coalition. The current coalition strategy has been heavily criticized for being flawed and overly expensive. The Pentagon has confirmed that the airstrike campaign has significantly surpassed the $1 billion mark. Now, critics of the airstrike campaign, including the Syrian President Bashar Assad, also say that it violates the integrity of a foreign country. Critics also say that ISIS controls the same territory as it did before the airstrikes, raising the question, of course, of how effective these airstrikes indeed are.
Iraqi-based political analyst Dr. Qusay Banouri thinks that Islamic State is a match for the US-led coalition tactics.
This is the first accident occurred with the national coalition to shut down its pilot. The cause is weakness of United States coalition. The solution to overcome the ISIS doesn't begin or enough from the airplane. It is no solution. They did nothing. Iraqi government, Syrian government will assist the national coalition to overcome ISIS, not just by airplane. It is not enough.
A mercenary group fighting against Islamic State in Iraq has also been badly hit. At least 38 of their number have been killed in a suicide bomb attack. The killer mingled among fighters from the Sawa movement as they gathered just south of Baghdad to collect wages. No group has yet admitted the bombing. Still to come here on RT International, what's supposed to be the beginning of a new era between the US and Cuba has already been marred by old disputes, as American firms demand the return of billions of dollars in assets that were frozen decades ago. Plus, a prankster scores in getting a payout for Russia's national football coach, who's not seen his salary since June. That story on the way. But before all that, zombies are rising in Slovenia against government corruption. Now, this is a protest movement which grew from comments by the country's former Prime Minister, who dismissed anti-corruption campaigners as zombies. They've even set up their own religion, the Trans-Universal Zombie Church of the Blissful Ringing. Since its launch a year ago, the movement's amassed 10,000 followers. It's also officially recognised as Slovenia's fifth largest religion. We spoke to its founder.
We made the church on the social network Facebook. The majority of our members at the time were protesters. We went to the street and say that not everything in our country is as it should be. There were a lot of things. There were about 75 billions stolen and sent to the offshore accounts in 20 years of our independence. From then on, they wanted and say, no, we have enough of that, we want to change the government. And we did. In a half-year time, the government fell.
On the way, the new evidence that could help explain what happened to doomed flight MH17 over Ukraine, and why the healing process between America and Cuba is opening up some old wounds.
Is it essentially given that we will face another major conflict, this time between the world powers?
Many of us feel we are yet again in 1938. I believe too that we need to look back at that time and to see what went wrong, what kind of attitudes and what kind of feelings of aggression that actually made us come into a war where so many million of lives were lost.
Do we speak your language? Want news, programs and documentaries in Arabic? It's all here on RT. Reporting from the world's hotspots, VIP interviews, intriguing stories. Are you here? Then try RT Arabic. To find out more, visit arabic.rt.com.
Welcome back to RT International. Next for you this hour, Russian investigators claim they have evidence that a Ukrainian fighter jet brought down Malaysian flight MH17, killing the 298 people on board. And they are willing to share it with the International Committee looking into the tragedy. An alleged whistleblower approached the Russian media with the claims. Our correspondent Murad Gazdiev joins us now with more details. Murad, this new evidence that was supposedly has broken through. What can you tell us about it?
Well, investigators are taking these alleged revelations very, very seriously. They've now met with this source, this man, and he took a polygraph test, a lie detector test, which they say he passed without any problems. They say his story is solid, that he wasn't confused about any of the details. What's more, it meshes with the facts that the Russian investigators already have about Ukraine's role in the downing of MH17.
Now, of course, if this turns out to be true, this would be sensational news. What exactly did this man have to tell the media?
Well, apparently this source served at an airfield in eastern Ukraine from which Ukrainian military jets launched airstrikes against the dissident east. And on the 17th of July, the day that MH17 went down, he says he witnessed a Su-25 fighter jet belonging to the Ukrainian Air Force take off with anti-air missiles equipped. When it came back from its mission, apparently those missiles were no longer there, presumably having been launched. And the pilot, a certain Captain Voloshin, when he got out of the aircraft, he was apparently visibly shaken. And here's what he had to say.
Фраза была от него слышна, когда из самолета вылез. Самолет не тот. И вечером вечерняя фраза была вопрос у одного летчика к нему, к этому же. Что там с самолетом? На что тот ответил, самолет оказался в ненужное время, в ненужном месте.
The Ukrainian government has confirmed that there is a Captain Voloshin in its air force, but it maintains that on the 17th of July, on that day, none of its aircraft were flying any missions. As for the source, this alleged witness, his identity for now is being protected because he still has family in Ukraine.
OK, with the very latest news there, that's our correspondent Murad Gazdiev. Thank you. It seemed that the United States and Cuba were on the road to leaving behind decades of frozen relations when these announcements came last week.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba.
We have decided to restore diplomatic relations.
Well, soon after, there was a warning from Raul Castro that the transition process won't be easy, with plenty of challenges to come. After the 1959 revolution, Cuba nationalised Western assets, most of which were American-owned. Since then, US corporations have filed around 6,000 compensation claims through a special committee in Washington. Back then, they were worth almost $2 billion. But this year, if you adjust for interest rates, well, that sum would amount to $7.5 billion. Cuba expert Gloria La Riva, a long-time campaigner against the US embargo, thinks Havana is unlikely to pay up even with relations restored.
The Cuban Revolution of 1959 meant that the property, the land, the factories, the means of production, the wealth of Cuba belongs to the Cuban people now. And we should remember the U.S. history, that when the U.S. had its revolution, the American Revolution, they didn't compensate or pay the British for what they had taken back. And the same goes for Cuba. The American companies and individuals who owned enormous amounts of wealth in Cuba, including all the utilities, the railroads, vast majority of the sugarcane fields and mills, the land of Cuba, so much property that rendered a population extremely poor and vast illiteracy, that they won't return to those days. What the American owners, the corporations and landholders owned in Cuba was stolen wealth, and it's not going to be returned to them.
Now, covering the news isn't usually a laughing matter, although this journalist certainly had trouble keeping a straight face. Reason for the reporter's fit of giggles? Well, he's standing next to a pile of drugs being destroyed. RT.com has the story. And also there, a feast for the eyes from NASA scientists who've captured the sun as never seen before. Find out how they got these stunning stellar shots by heading to our website. Now, he's the brains that trains Russia's football team and reportedly is the highest paid national coach anywhere in the world. But Fabio Capello hasn't seen a penny of his salary since June. And what is more, the weakening ruble means his €9 million salary is worth much more in Russia than it was before. And the Russian Football Union admits it doesn't have the money to pay. Understandably, Capello's somewhat upset by the situation, but he says that he's working in Russia not because of the money, but for football's sake. However, as another payday deadline flew by, a local prankster decided to take the matter into his own hands. Igor Piskunov spoke to Yunin O'Neill about how that turned out.
Prankster Vavan, who is known for making prank phone calls to hundreds of people, officials and even heads of state, decided just to call both conflicting sides here. The people who owe Capello the money, which is the football union, and the people who are supposed to supervise and monitor that he's paid, which is the Russian labor watchdog. And basically he agreed with both sides on a new deadline for his salary to be paid, which is now January 19th.
So a deal was done, even though this person is as you say, a prankster. It was a fake deal, but it seems to have come into life, and it's going to happen.
They took it completely seriously. He introduced himself in both phone calls as the other side, so they never thought it was fake. In fact, after that, the labor watchdog released a statement saying officially that he could get paid in January, which is apparently going to happen.
And what happens now, though, with this guy, this prankster? Because I know that he's got a bit of a big name here. He's got other plans on the horizon, doesn't he?
Yeah, exactly. He said that he tried to phone Capello himself to break the good news to him, but he couldn't find his phone number. But he did manage to speak to a whole lot of different officials before that. He says that it's way more than 100 people, including heads of several states. Well, his next target, he says, is the official spokesperson of the U.S. State Department, Jane Psaki.
So watch this space, see what happens next.
Definitely, that should be really interesting.
OK, let's quickly round up some other global headlines for you now. We'll start with mass unrest that's erupted in Indian-controlled Kashmir over the arrest of a separatist leader's supporters. Youth activists were among those detained after elections which saw victory for the People's Democratic Party. Kashmir endured 2 wars, and for decades separatists have been trying to gain independence from India. Elsewhere, northern Malaysia has been struck by heavy flooding following driving rains in the area. Dozens of homes have been submerged, forcing hundreds of residents to seek shelter. Roads have been washed away, with rescue efforts being coordinated by helicopter and boat. Villagers in one state say that it's the worst flooding they've endured in almost 30 years. But on a positive ending, Christmas spirit is spreading worldwide and even beyond. The International Space Station is fully ready for festivities, as we can see here. Crew members have decorated their holiday home and will even enjoy a unique festive dinner. It includes fruit, vegetables, even a can of black caviar. Perhaps not what you'd call all the trimmings, but probably quite a bit healthier. Stay with us. On the way, Erin Aid on how today's leaders could learn a thing or two from how previous depressions were handled.